A wealthy businessman sent a shocking invitation to a homeless boy, inviting him to his son's extravagant birthday party at their luxurious mansion. His true intentions were darker than anyone could imagine. He wanted to use the boy as entertainment, to show his wealthy guests how the other half lived. But when the child arrived at the party, looking dignified despite his worn clothes, everything changed. The father who came looking for him hours later left everyone speechless, and what happened next was even more stunning. Hit the like button to keep following our upcoming videos, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive more incredible stories like this one. Augusto walked down a busy street in downtown Manhattan, having just left a meeting with one of his business partners. Despite his fortune allowing him to travel in the most luxurious vehicles, he preferred to walk the last few blocks to his house, enjoying these moments of anonymity amid the daily routine of ordinary people. However, that afternoon, something disrupted his tranquility. He felt a quick tug at the back pocket of his pants. When he turned around, he saw a thin boy with worn clothes and a dirt-stained face holding his wallet with trembling hands. The boy's enormous eyes, filled with a mix of fear and determination, stared at him fixedly. He couldn't have been older than 12, though the weight of the life he led made him appear older. "Give it back," Augusto said, more surprised than threatening. The boy, caught in the act, immediately dropped the wallet and took a step back, as if expecting a scolding or worse. However, Augusto didn't raise his voice or look at him with anger. Instead, he noticed something in the boy's gaze, desperation, the kind that only someone at the limit of their strength could feel. "Are you hungry?" he asked, putting his wallet back in his pocket. The boy looked at him confused, unsure how to respond. After a few seconds, he nodded without saying a word. Augusto sighed and looked around. The street was full of people going about their day as if nothing had happened. No one had noticed the small incident. "Come with me," he said, nodding in the direction he was going. "Where?" asked the boy in a distrustful tone, stepping back a little more. "To my house. I'll give you something to eat and a place to spend the night." The boy stared at him intently, trying to decipher if he was telling the truth. Finally, as if fatigue and hunger had won the battle against his instinct of distrust, he agreed with a slight nod of his head. They walked in silence until they reached a large but simple house compared to the mansions in the area. Augusto opened the door and gestured for him to enter. The boy hesitated at the threshold, as if about to change his mind, but finally took a step inside. "What's your name?" Augusto asked while closing the door behind them. "Tommy," the boy responded almost in a whisper. "Well, Tommy, sit on the sofa. I'll look for something for you to eat." While Augusto disappeared into the kitchen, Tommy looked around. The house was cozy, with furniture that seemed chosen more for comfort than design. In a corner, there were family photos. A young man, a woman with a warm smile, and an elderly woman with a serious expression. Tommy didn't get close to look, knowing he didn't belong there. When Augusto returned with a plate of food, he found Tommy sitting on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped together, and gaze fixed on the floor. He extended the plate, and the boy accepted it awkwardly, as if he wasn't used to receiving anything without having to ask for it or fight for it. As he ate, Augusto decided he should introduce him to his mother, Doña Helena. Although their relationship was distant, he deeply respected her. He went upstairs to his mother's room and briefly explained the situation. "I brought a boy home, Mother. His name is Tommy, and he seems to need help." Doña Helena, sitting in her bed, looked up. Although her body was weakened by illness, her mind remained as sharp as ever. She nodded with a neutral expression, but her eyes reflected a mixture of curiosity and reservation. When Augusto returned to the living room, Tommy had finished eating. He offered him to stay in one of the guest rooms, and after a moment of hesitation, the boy accepted. As he guided him to the room, Augusto couldn't help but wonder what had led him to bring him home. Maybe it was guilt for all he had and never shared, or maybe he simply couldn't ignore those eyes loaded with stories he couldn't even imagine. That night, As Tommy curled up in bed, clean for the first time in who knows how long, Augusto sat in his office, looking out the window toward the street, thinking about the strange chain of events that had led him to this moment. He didn't know what impact Tommy would have on his life, but something inside told him that nothing would be the same after that day. After ensuring Tommy was comfortable in the guest room, Augusto returned to his private study. The room was dimly lit, the silence broken only by the ticking of an antique clock on the wall. He sat in his leather chair, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk, while his mind wandered to the upcoming party he was planning for his son's birthday. His son, Richard, was turning 16. The party was meant to be the social event of the season, with the city's most influential families in attendance. As he thought about Tommy's presence in his house, a dark idea began forming in his mind. He picked up his phone and dialed his event planner. "Sarah?" "Yes. I need to make a slight modification to the guest list," he said, his voice carrying an edge that would have worried anyone who knew him well. "Add one more person. A special guest." In another part of the mansion, Doña Helena couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the boy her son had brought home. There was something about this situation that stirred old memories she'd rather forget. She reached for her bell, and within moments, Martha, the housekeeper who had served the family for decades, appeared at her door. "You called, ma'am?" Martha asked, adjusting her uniform. "Tell me about the boy," Doña Helena commanded softly. "Have you seen him? What do you make of him?" Martha hesitated before responding. "He seems different from what you might expect, ma'am. There's something in his eyes, a kind of wisdom that children his age shouldn't have." Doña Helena nodded slowly. "Keep an eye on him, Martha, and report anything unusual directly to me." The next morning, Tommy woke up disoriented, momentarily forgetting where he was. The soft mattress and clean sheets felt foreign after months of sleeping on cardboard and concrete. He carefully made his way downstairs, following the smell of fresh coffee and bacon. In the kitchen, he found Martha preparing breakfast. She gave him a measured look before gesturing to a chair at the small kitchen table. "Sit," she said, not unkindly. "Mr. Augusto will be down shortly." As Tommy ate the first real breakfast he'd had in months, Augusto entered the kitchen, already dressed in an impeccable suit. He watched the boy for a moment before speaking. "Tommy, I have a proposition for you," he began, his voice carefully neutral. "My son is having his birthday party this weekend. A rather grand affair. Would you like to attend?" The boy froze mid-bite, his fork suspended in the air. Martha, who had been wiping down counters, also stopped her movements, though she pretended not to listen. "Me?" Tommy asked, his voice barely a whisper. "At a party?" "Yes," Augusto continued, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You'll need proper clothes, of course, and we'll have to clean you up a bit, but I think it would be educational for everyone involved." Tommy looked down at his worn clothes, then back at Augusto. "Why would you want me there?" "Let's just say I believe in creating meaningful experiences," Augusto replied smoothly. "Sometimes people need to be reminded of certain realities." Martha's hands tightened on her cleaning cloth, but she remained silent. She'd worked for the family long enough to recognize when Mr. Augusto was plotting something, and this time her instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. Meanwhile, upstairs in her room, Doña Helena was having her own thoughts about the situation. She'd heard everything through the house's old heating vents, which had long served as an unofficial intercom system. Her son's tone had triggered warning bells in her mind, reminding her of his father's voice when he used to plan his own social manipulations. Later that day, as Martha helped Tommy get settled with some clean clothes from storage, she couldn't shake her unease about the situation. The boy seemed genuine in his gratitude, but there was something else there too, a shrewdness that suggested he wasn't as naive as he appeared. "Why do you think he really wants me at the party?" Tommy asked her quietly as she helped him try on an old suit that had belonged to Richard. Martha met his eyes in the mirror. "I don't know, child," she replied honestly, "but in this house, things are rarely what they seem." As the day progressed, preparations for the party began in earnest. Decorators arrived carrying elaborate centerpieces and expensive linens. Through it all, Tommy watched from various corners of the house, observing everything with those wise, wary eyes. Augusto spent most of the day in his study, making phone calls and occasionally emerging to inspect the progress of the preparations. Each time he passed Tommy, he would give him that same mysterious smile, like a man savoring a private joke. What no one in the house realized was that this party would become a turning point in all their lives, unleashing a chain of events that would expose long-buried secrets and force everyone to confront truths they'd spent years trying to forget. As the party drew closer, the mansion buzzed with activity. Florists arranged elaborate displays, while caterers planned the menu for over 200 guests. Through it all, Tommy moved like a ghost, observing everything with quiet intensity. He'd learned early in life that being invisible had its advantages. That afternoon, while passing by Augusto's study, he overheard a conversation that made him pause. "Everything is arranged exactly as you requested, Mr. Augusto," a man's voice said. "The press will be there to cover the party. It's quite unusual to have media presence at a private birthday celebration." "The Times Society columnist owes me a favor," Augusto replied. "Make sure they get good photos of all our guests, especially our special guest." Tommy silently backed away from the door, his heart racing. He'd survived long enough on the streets to recognize when someone was setting up a scene, but for what purpose? In the kitchen, Martha was preparing tea for Doña Helena when Tommy entered. She noticed his troubled expression immediately. "What's wrong, child?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "Why would Mr. Augusto want newspaper people at his son's party?" Tommy asked, watching Martha's face carefully. The housekeeper's hands stilled on the tea tray. After a moment, she spoke carefully. "Mr. Augusto has always been particular about appearances. He likes to control how people see things." Before Tommy could respond, Richard, Augusto's son, walked into the kitchen. He stopped short at seeing Tommy, his expression a mix of curiosity and something else. Was it embarrassment? "So you're the one Dad's been talking about," Richard said, grabbing an apple from the fruit bowl. "The special guest." Tommy met his gaze steadily. "Guess so." Richard took a bite of his apple, studying Tommy. "You know, it's weird. Dad never shows interest in charity cases. No offense." "None taken," Tommy replied, his voice neutral. "But maybe I'm not a charity case." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly at that. "No? Then what are you?" Before Tommy could answer, Martha intervened. "Master Richard, your father's looking for you. Something about your suit fitting." After Richard left, Tommy turned to Martha. "He doesn't know, does he? What his father's planning?" Martha sighed deeply. "I don't think anyone really knows what Mr. Augusto is planning. Except maybe." "Except who?" "Doña Helena, his mother. She sees more than people think." Upstairs, Doña Helena was indeed seeing plenty. From her window, she watched as more deliveries arrived. Champagne, flowers, elaborate ice sculptures. But her mind was elsewhere, remembering another party many years ago when her late husband had orchestrated a similar lesson for their social circle. That evening, as Tommy sat in his borrowed room, there was a soft knock at the door. It was Doña Helena's nurse, Angela. "Doña Helena would like to see you," she said quietly. Tommy followed Angela to the elderly woman's room. Doña Helena was sitting in her favorite chair by the window, a heavy shawl around her shoulders despite the warm evening. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing to a chair across from her. "Tell me, boy, what do you make of my son?" Tommy chose his words carefully. "He's complicated." A hint of a smile touched Doña Helena's lips. "Indeed. And what do you make of his invitation to this party?" "I think—" Tommy paused, then decided on honesty. "I think he wants to use me for something. To prove a point, maybe." Doña Helena's eyes sharpened. "You're smarter than you let on. Good. You'll need to be." She reached for a small box on the table beside her and opened it, revealing an old photograph. "Do you know who this is?" Tommy leaned forward to look. The photo showed a younger Augusto standing next to another man, both in business suits, both smiling, though their eyes were hard. "That's your son," Tommy said, "but I don't know the other man." "That's Thomas Montgomery," Doña Helena said, watching Tommy's face carefully. "He was my husband's business partner many years ago, before he disappeared." Something in her tone made Tommy look up sharply. "Disappeared?" "Yes, along with his young son. Nobody ever knew what happened to them." She paused, studying Tommy intently. "The boy would be about your age now if he'd lived." A chill ran down Tommy's spine, though he couldn't say why. Before he could respond, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Doña Helena quickly put the photo away. "Remember what I said about being smart," she whispered as Augusto appeared in the doorway. "And watch yourself at the party." Augusto looked between them, his expression unreadable. "Is everything all right, Mother?" "Just getting to know our guest," she replied calmly. "After all, it's not every day we have someone so interesting in our home." That night, lying in his bed, Tommy couldn't sleep. His mind kept returning to the photograph, to the way Doña Helena had looked at him, and to the growing certainty that he was walking into something much bigger than a simple birthday party. The day before the party, the mansion transformed into a hive of controlled chaos. Workers streamed in and out, carrying everything from crystal chandeliers to elaborate flower arrangements. Tommy watched from the second-floor landing as Augusto directed it all like a conductor leading an orchestra. "The boy needs a proper haircut," Augusto announced during breakfast, eyeing Tommy's unruly hair. "And a fitting for the suit. Everything must be perfect for tomorrow." Martha was instructed to take Tommy to the family's longtime tailor, an elderly man named Mr. Chen, who had a small shop downtown. As they rode in the back of the car, Tommy noticed Martha's hands fidgeting with her purse strap. "You're worried," he said. It wasn't a question. Martha glanced at him, then back out the window. "Mr. Chen has worked for this family for 30 years. He knows things." At the shop, Mr. Chen's eyes widened slightly when he saw Tommy. The old tailor adjusted his glasses, looking at the boy as if seeing a ghost. "Martha," he said slowly, "this boy—" "Just a fitting, Mr. Chen," Martha interrupted quickly, "for tomorrow's party." Mr. Chen nodded, but his hands trembled slightly as he took Tommy's measurements. He kept glancing at an old photograph on his wall, a group picture of what appeared to be his regular clients from years ago. "Stand still," he muttered to Tommy, "just like you're just stand still." Back at the mansion, Richard was having an argument with his father in the study. Tommy could hear their raised voices as he passed by. "It's my birthday party," Richard was saying. "Why are you turning it into one of your social experiments?" "You don't understand what I'm trying to teach you," Augusto replied, his voice stern. "Sometimes people need to see..." "See what? How cruel you can be. I'm not blind, Dad. I've seen how you look at him, like he's some kind of prop in your games." The voices fell silent as Tommy hurried past, his new suit wrapped in plastic under his arm. He nearly collided with Doña Helena's nurse, Angela, who was carrying a stack of old photo albums. "Sorry," he mumbled, helping her pick up a few that had fallen. "It's all right," she said, but then grabbed his wrist as he handed her the last album. Her eyes searched his face intently. "You look so much like..." "Like who?" Tommy asked, but Angela just shook her head and hurried away. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set, Tommy found himself in the mansion's vast library. He'd always loved books, finding them wherever he could on the streets, discarded novels, old magazines, anything with words to escape into. He was running his fingers along the spines of leather-bound volumes when he noticed a small notebook that had fallen behind one of the shelves. It was old, its pages yellow with age. When he opened it, he recognized Doña Helena's handwriting. 1995, the first page read. "Thomas came to Augusto today about the discrepancies in the accounts. I fear what my son might do. He's becoming more like his father every day." Tommy's hands shook as he turned the page, but before he could read more, he heard footsteps. He quickly shoved the notebook back behind the shelf. Augusto appeared in the doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor. "Ah, Tommy. Good. We need to discuss your role at tomorrow's party." Tommy's heart raced, but he kept his face neutral. "My role?" "Yes," Augusto smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You see, I believe in teaching valuable lessons. Tomorrow's guests need to understand certain realities about life. You'll help me demonstrate those realities." "By being the poor kid you saved from the streets?" Tommy asked quietly. Augusto's smile widened. "Smart boy. Yes, something like that. Though there might be more to the story than even you realize." After Augusto left, Tommy remained in the library, his mind spinning. He thought about the old photograph in Doña Helena's room, Mr. Chen's strange reaction, Angela's unfinished sentence, and now this mysterious notebook. He was so lost in thought that he barely noticed when Richard entered the library, closing the door behind him. "I know what my father's planning," Richard said without preamble. "Or at least I think I do. He wants to humiliate you tomorrow, make some kind of example out of you." Tommy looked at him steadily. "And you're telling me this because? Because I've seen him do this before. Destroy people to prove a point." Richard ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "But there's something different this time. The way he looks at you, it's like he's afraid of something." Before Tommy could respond, they heard Martha calling for him. It was time for dinner. That night, as the mansion settled into an uneasy quiet, Tommy lay awake in his bed. Through his window, he could see workers setting up tables and lights in the garden for tomorrow's party. Everything looked perfect, pristine, controlled, just as Augusto wanted it. But Tommy had learned long ago that the most perfectly controlled situations were often the ones most likely to shatter. And as he finally drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow's party would crack open secrets that had been buried for years. The morning of the party dawned clear and bright. Tommy stood in front of his bedroom mirror, barely recognizing himself in the tailored suit. Mr. Chen's precise measurements had transformed him from a street kid into something else entirely, though what exactly, he wasn't sure. Martha appeared at his door, her face tight with worry. "The guests will start arriving at 6, she said, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. "Mr. Augusto wants you to wait in the study until he calls for you. He says he wants to make a proper introduction." Downstairs, the final preparations were underway. Ice sculptures were being positioned, champagne was being chilled, and the catering staff moved efficiently through the house like a well-choreographed dance troupe. Through it all, Augusto prowled the premises, inspecting every detail with critical eyes. "The Times photographer will be here at 7, he informed his event coordinator. "Make sure everything is perfect for the special announcement." In her room, Doña Helena was being helped into an elegant black dress by Angela. Her hands clutched a small envelope that she had been holding all morning. "Should I give it to him now?" she asked Angela, her voice unusually uncertain. "Before it all begins?" Angela shook her head. "Wait, watch. The truth has its own timing." By late afternoon, Tommy could hear the growing buzz of activity from his position in the study. He'd found an old newspaper in one of the desk drawers and was reading it to pass the time when something caught his eye. A small article from 20 years ago about the mysterious disappearance of a prominent businessman and his young son. Before he could read more, Richard slipped into the room, closing the door quietly behind him. "They're starting to arrive," he said, his face pale. "Dad's got something planned, something big. I heard him talking to his lawyer earlier about some kind of announcement." Tommy carefully folded the newspaper and put it back in the drawer. "Your father seems to like his surprises." Richard ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit Tommy had noticed. "Listen, whatever he's planning, just remember it's not about you. It's never really about the people he uses in his games. It's always about him, about proving something to himself. The sound of classical music began drifting up from below, along with the murmur of arriving guests. Tommy could hear car doors slamming, elegant laughter, the clink of glasses. "Mr. Augusto wants you downstairs now." Martha appeared at the door, her face drawn. "He says it's time." As Tommy descended the grand staircase, he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him. The massive foyer was filled with New York's elite, women dripping in jewels, men in perfectly tailored tuxedos, all of them watching him with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed disdain. Augusto stood at the bottom of the stairs, a champagne flute in his hand, and that same mysterious smile playing at his lips. "Ah, here he is," he announced, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Our special guest of the evening." The murmurs grew louder as Tommy reached the bottom step. He could hear snippets of whispered conversations. Who is he? Where did Augusto find him? Is this some kind of charity thing? But something else was happening too. Among the older guests, there were strange reactions. An elderly woman nearly dropped her glass, her hand flying to her throat. A man with silver hair took several steps backward, his face draining of color. "Thomas?" the elderly woman whispered, though Tommy wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or to a memory. Augusto's smile widened as he placed a hand on Tommy's shoulder, his grip just tight enough to be uncomfortable. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I have a story to tell you tonight. A story about consequences, about the past catching up with us, about justice delayed but not denied." But before he could continue, there was a commotion at the entrance. The massive front doors had swung open, and a man stood in the doorway, backlit by the setting sun. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a path between the newcomer and where Tommy stood with Augusto. As the man stepped into the light, several guests gasped. Even Augusto's iron grip on Tommy's shoulder faltered for a moment. The man was tall, distinguished-looking, despite his well-worn suit. His face was deeply lined, but his eyes were sharp and clear, eyes that looked exactly like Tommy's. He scanned the crowd slowly before his gaze settled on Augusto. "Good evening, old friend," the man said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. "I believe you have my son." The silence in the grand hall was deafening. For a moment, it seemed as if everyone had collectively forgotten to breathe. Augusto's face, usually a mask of perfect control, had gone ashen. His hand fell away from Tommy's shoulder, as if burned. "Thomas Montgomery," Augusto finally managed, his voice barely steady. "You're supposed to be dead." Thomas finished for him, taking another step forward. "Yes, that would have been convenient for you, wouldn't it?" The assembled guests began to whisper among themselves. The name Montgomery rippled through the crowd like a wave. Many of the older guests clearly recognized him, though they looked as if they were seeing a ghost. Doña Helena had appeared at the top of the stairs, gripping the railing with white-knuckled hands. Angela stood beside her, supporting her elbow. But the elderly woman's eyes were sharp and alert as they moved between Thomas and her son. Tommy stood frozen, staring at the man who had just claimed to be his father. There was no denying the resemblance. They had the same eyes, the same set of their jaw, even the same way of standing. His mind raced back to the photograph he'd seen in Doña Helena's room, the one of the younger Augusto with his business partner. "This is impossible," Augusto said, recovering some of his composure. He turned to address the crowd, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, please don't let this unexpected interruption disturb you. This man is clearly disturbed." "Am I?" Thomas's voice cut through Augusto's words like a knife. "Then perhaps we should discuss exactly what happened 20 years ago, Augusto. Should we tell your guests about the missing funds, about the forged documents, about how you arranged for my convenient disappearance when I threatened to expose you?" Richard had moved closer to Tommy, his face a mixture of shock and growing understanding. "Dad," he said, his voice smaller than Tommy had ever heard it. "What's he talking about?" But Augusto ignored his son, his attention fixed on Thomas. You have no proof of anything, he said, but there was a tremor in his voice that hadn't been there before. Don't I? Thomas reached into his worn jacket and pulled out an envelope. 20 years is a long time, Augusto. Long enough to gather evidence. Long enough to build a case. Long enough to find my son. He turned to Tommy then, his hard expression softening. I've been looking for you for so long, he said quietly. When I saw the announcement in the paper about this party, saw your picture, I knew I had to come. Martha had pressed herself against a wall, her hands covering her mouth. She had known, Tommy realized. She had recognized him from the beginning, but had been too afraid to say anything. Mr. Chen's strange reaction during the fitting, Angela's unfinished sentence, Doña Helena's cryptic warnings, it all started to make sense. If what you're saying is true, Tommy found himself speaking, his voice stronger than he expected, why didn't you find me sooner? Where have you been all these years? The pain that flashed across Thomas's face looked genuine. I was running, he admitted, running and hiding and gathering proof. When Augusto's plan went into motion all those years ago, I barely escaped with my life. But in the chaos, I lost you. By the time I could safely return to look for you, you had disappeared into the system. Enough! Augusto's voice cracked like a whip. This is ridiculous. I won't have you spreading these lies at my son's birthday party. Security! But before anyone could move, Doña Helena's voice rang out from the top of the stairs. No! Just that one word, but it carried such authority that everyone froze. She began to descend the stairs, Angela hovering anxiously beside her. Mother, Augusto started, but she cut him off with a look. I've kept silent for too long, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. Thomas is telling the truth. I know because I was there. I saw what you did, son. I saw everything. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out her own envelope, and I've kept proof of my own. The crowd erupted in murmurs again. Richard had stumbled backward until he hit a wall, his face a mask of horror as he stared at his father. The Times photographer, who had been quietly documenting everything, was frantically taking pictures. Tommy looked between Thomas and Augusto, seeing the past and present collide in their faces. The truth was finally emerging, but he had a feeling this was just the beginning. The real storm was still to come. The elegant party had devolved into chaos. Some guests were discreetly making their way toward the exits, while others lingered, too fascinated by the unfolding drama to leave. The catering staff stood frozen, trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres forgotten in their hands. Doña Helena had reached the bottom of the stairs, Angela still at her side. Her hands trembled as she held out the envelope. I kept everything, Augusto. Every document, every piece of evidence that Thomas gave me for safekeeping before you forced him to run. Mother, please. Augusto's voice had lost its usual authority. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand perfectly, she replied, her voice sharp with years of suppressed anger. I understood 20 years ago when you began embezzling from your own company. I understood when Thomas discovered it and came to you, trying to handle it quietly. And I understood when you arranged for him to disappear. Richard pushed himself away from the wall, his face pale. Is it true? He asked his father. Did you really try to kill him? Augusto turned to his son, desperation creeping into his expression. Everything I did was to protect our family, our legacy. Thomas was going to ruin everything I'd built. You mean everything you'd stolen? Thomas interjected quietly. He turned to address the remaining guests. Augusto didn't build his fortune. He stole it, piece by piece, through careful manipulation of accounts and creative bookkeeping. When I discovered the discrepancies, you threatened to expose me, Augusto suddenly shouted, his carefully maintained facade cracking completely. You were going to destroy everything. I came to you as a friend, Thomas replied, his voice steady. I offered to help you make it right, to find a way to repay the money quietly. But you couldn't accept that, could you? Your pride wouldn't let you. Martha had moved closer to Tommy, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. He could feel her trembling, but her grip was firm. "I remember that night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying in the tense silence. "Mr. Thomas came to the house late, saying he had proof of something terrible. The next day we heard about the accident, about how his car had gone off the road. An accident you arranged," Thomas said to Augusto. "But you didn't count on me surviving. You didn't count on the fisherman who pulled me from the river, who helped me hide until I could gather enough evidence to prove what you'd done. And my mother," Tommy found himself asking. What happened to her? A flash of genuine pain crossed Thomas's face. "She died while I was in hiding. I couldn't come back, couldn't risk Augusto finding out I was alive. By the time I could safely return, you had disappeared into the foster system." Doña Helena stepped forward, opening her envelope. "But I never stopped looking for you, child. I hired private investigators, followed every lead I could find. When I saw you that first day, when Augusto brought you home, I knew. You look so much like your father did at your age." "You knew?" Augusto turned on his mother, his voice incredulous. "All this time you knew he was Thomas's son?" "Of course I knew," she replied. "Just as I knew you would try to use him somehow, try to turn him into another one of your cruel object lessons. But you didn't count on his father showing up, did you? You thought Thomas was safely dead, his son lost forever in the system." The Times photographer had been quietly documenting everything, his camera clicking steadily. Augusto suddenly seemed to remember his presence and lunged toward him. "Give me that camera!" Several things happened at once. The photographer backed away, clutching his camera protectively. Security guards, who had been uncertainly watching the scene unfold, moved forward, and Richard stepped between his father and the photographer. "No," Richard said firmly. "No more covering things up, no more lies." Augusto stared at his son as if seeing him for the first time. The look of betrayal on his face quickly morphed into something harder, colder. "You don't understand what's at stake here." "I understand perfectly," Richard replied, unconsciously echoing his grandmother's words. "I understand that everything I thought I knew about you, about our family, has been built on lies." Tommy watched the scene unfold, feeling strangely detached. He looked at Thomas, his father, who had moved closer to him, close enough that Tommy could see the years of pain and determination etched in his face. "There's more," Thomas said quietly. "So much more that needs to be revealed. Are you ready to hear it all?" The remaining party guests had gathered in a loose circle around the unfolding drama, their earlier pretense of disinterest abandoned. Several had their phones out, recording everything. The Times photographer had backed into a corner, still taking pictures while trying to remain inconspicuous. Thomas reached into his worn jacket and pulled out a thick folder. "I've spent 20 years building this case, Augusto. 20 years gathering every scrap of evidence, following every paper trail, finding every person you tried to silence." Augusto's lawyer, who had been watching from the sidelines, suddenly stepped forward. "Mr. Montgomery, I must advise everyone here that any accusations without proper legal channels." Thomas's laugh was harsh. "Like the ones Augusto used to have me declared dead? Or perhaps like the ones he used to hide the money he stole from his investors?" He opened the folder and began laying documents on a nearby table. Bank statements, transfer records, witness testimonies, everything that proves how Augusto built his empire on fraud and theft. Richard moved closer to examine the documents, his face growing paler with each page he read. "These are real," he said quietly. "These are our company's internal documents, but the numbers, they don't match what we've been reporting." "Of course they don't," Thomas replied. "Your father has been running 2 sets of books for decades, one for the public, one for himself. I discovered it by accident when I was reviewing the quarterly reports. When I confronted him about it, you threatened to expose everything." Augusto cut in, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "You would have destroyed not just me, but everyone who depended on the company. I offered you a chance to make it right." Thomas's calm finally cracked. "I came to you as a friend, as a partner. I offered to help you find a way to return the money, to save the company legitimately. But you couldn't bear the thought of anyone knowing the great Augusto had failed." Doña Helena stepped forward, her own envelope still clutched in her hands. "I remember that night," she said. "You came to the house late, Thomas. You were worried, but you still thought you could reason with my son." She turned to Augusto, her expression a mixture of sadness and determination. "But you'd already made your plans, hadn't you? You'd already arranged the accident that would silence Thomas forever." "What I did," Augusto said through clenched teeth, "I did to protect this family, to protect our name, our legacy." "Our legacy?" Richard's voice cracked with emotion. "Our legacy is built on theft and attempted murder." Martha, who'd been quiet throughout the revelations, suddenly spoke up. "There's more," she said softly, "about Tommy's mother." The room fell silent. Tommy, who had been trying to process everything, felt his heart skip a beat. Thomas turned to Martha, his expression pained. "Sarah," he said quietly, "she never stopped looking for Tommy. Even after I had to disappear, she kept searching. She went to Augusto, begging him to help find our son." "And you turned her away," Doña Helena finished, looking at her son with disgust. "A desperate mother looking for her child, and you turned her away, knowing exactly what had happened to her husband, knowing exactly where her son had ended up." Tommy felt as if the floor was tilting beneath his feet. "My mother came here," he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "She looked for me?" "Until the day she died," Thomas confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "The stress, the grief, it was too much for her heart. When I finally managed to return, to search for you myself, she was already gone." Augusto had begun to back away, his eyes darting between the faces surrounding him. The mask of control had completely crumbled, replaced by something almost feral. "You have no proof," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "None of this will stand up in court." "That's where you're wrong," said a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see a man in a dark suit holding up a badge. "FBI. We've been building this case for quite some time, Mr. Albuquerque. Mr. Montgomery's evidence was the final piece we needed." As two more agents entered the room, Augusto's face went completely white. He looked at his son, at his mother, at Tommy, searching for any ally, any escape route. But he found only accusation and disgust in their eyes. "All these years," he said, his voice suddenly sounding old and tired. "All these years of keeping the secret, of building the lie, and it ends like this, because of a street boy who happened to look like his father?" "No," Tommy said, surprising himself with the strength in his voice. "It ends like this because the truth always finds its way out. Always." The arrival of the FBI agents transformed the party scene into something surreal. Crystal champagne glasses sat abandoned on elegant tables, while men in dark suits moved efficiently through the crowd, collecting statements from shell-shocked guests. The Times photographer had been quietly asked to surrender his camera's memory card as evidence, though copies of the photos had already been secured. Augusto sat in his leather office chair, his normally immaculate appearance now disheveled, as agents methodically went through his files. His lawyer stood nearby, speaking in hushed tones about rights and procedures, but Augusto seemed beyond hearing. In the main hall, Richard watched the agents work with a dazed expression. "I should have known," he said to no one in particular. "All those times he told me not to question his decisions, to trust that he knew best. I should have known something wasn't right." Tommy stood with Thomas near the grand staircase, both still processing the reality of their reunion. Neither seemed to know quite what to say to the other. 20 years of separation had left them strangers, connected by blood and shared trauma. "I have so many questions," Tommy finally said, his voice quiet but steady. "About you, about Mom, about everything." Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and hope. "I have 20 years of answers to give you, son, and a lifetime to make up for what was taken from us. Doña Helena had settled into her favorite chair by the window, watching the scene unfold with a strange combination of satisfaction and sorrow. Martha stood beside her, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with her apron. "I should have spoken up sooner," Doña Helena said, her voice heavy with regret. "Perhaps if I had—" "You did what you could," Martha replied gently. "You never stopped looking for Tommy, never stopped gathering evidence. You knew this day would come eventually." The lead FBI agent, who had introduced himself as Agent Cooper, was now speaking with Thomas. "We'll need you to come in tomorrow to make a formal statement," he was saying. "The evidence you've gathered over the years, combined with our own investigation, makes this case pretty solid. But we'll still need to do everything by the book." From the office, Augusto's voice suddenly rose in a shout. "You can't do this. Do you have any idea who I am in this city?" "A fraudster," Richard said, walking into the office to face his father. "A thief, a man who tried to kill his business partner and then spent 20 years pretending to be something he's not." Augusto stared at his son, his face a mask of disbelief. "Everything I did was for you, to give you the life you deserve." "No," Richard's voice was firm. "Everything you did was for yourself. Your pride, your reputation, your need to be seen as powerful and successful. Well, congratulations, Dad. Now everyone will see you for exactly what you are." The words seemed to hit Augusto like physical blows. He slumped in his chair, suddenly looking old and defeated. The carefully constructed facade of the powerful businessman had crumbled completely, revealing the desperate man beneath. In the hall, Tommy watched as agents began sealing off Augusto's office with crime scene tape. The party decorations seemed grotesque now. Crystal chandeliers throwing rainbow lights across serious FBI agents, elegant flower arrangements witnessing the collapse of an empire built on lies. "What happens now?" he asked his father. Thomas put a hand on his shoulder, tentatively, as if unsure he had the right. Now we begin again. There's so much time to make up for, so much to rebuild." "The company?" Richard had joined them, his face troubled. "What happens to everyone who works for us? All the innocent people who depend on their jobs?" "The company can be saved," Thomas assured him. "The foundations are solid. It was only your father's fraudulent dealings that were corrupt. With proper management and transparency, it can be rebuilt." Doña Helena called Tommy over to her chair. When he reached her, she took his hand in her frail ones. "I kept every piece of information about you that I could find," she said. "Every news clipping, every report from the private investigators I hired. I never stopped hoping we would find you." Tommy felt tears prickling at his eyes. "Why didn't you say something when I first arrived?" "I needed to be sure," she replied. "And I needed to gather enough courage to finally stand up to my son. When I saw you, you looked so much like your father did at your age. I knew it was time for the truth to come out." From the office came the sound of handcuffs clicking shut. Augusto was being led out by 2 agents, his lawyer trailing behind, still spouting legal terminology. As he passed through the hall, he caught sight of Tommy standing with Doña Helena. For a moment, their eyes met. In that brief exchange, Tommy saw something shift in Augusto's expression, perhaps the first glimmer of understanding about the true cost of his actions, the lives he had destroyed in his pursuit of power and control. Then Augusto was gone, led away through the front doors that had welcomed so many elegant guests just hours before. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the now quiet mansion, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel as the FBI vehicles pulled away. In the days following Augusto's arrest, the mansion underwent a profound transformation. The elaborate party decorations were cleared away, replaced by the somber atmosphere of a house coming to terms with its past. FBI agents continued their investigation, moving methodically through decades of financial records and correspondence. Richard had thrown himself into saving the company, working closely with Thomas to identify and correct his father's fraudulent dealings. The process was painful but necessary, like cleaning an old wound that had been allowed to fester for too long. "We'll need to be completely transparent," Thomas explained during one late-night session in the study. "Show everyone exactly what happened and how we're going to fix it." Richard nodded, his young face showing a maturity that hadn't been there before. "The company was built on more than just my father's lies," he said. "There are good people who work for us, honest people. We owe it to them to make this right." Tommy spent his days getting to know his father, filling in the 20-year void that separated them. They would sit in the garden for hours, Thomas answering every question Tommy had about his mother, their life before the separation, and the years that followed. "She was the strongest person I've ever known," Thomas said one afternoon, describing Sarah. "Even after I had to disappear, she never gave up hope. She kept searching for you until—" His voice trailed off, but Tommy understood. The weight of their lost years together hung between them, but it was gradually being replaced by something new, the careful construction of a relationship that had been stolen from them. Doña Helena had taken to watching them from her window, her face softening whenever she saw them together. "Sometimes," she told Martha one day, "the truth hurts before it heals, but it always needs to come out." Martha, who had been with the family through everything, nodded in agreement. "The house feels different now," she said, "lighter somehow, even with everything that's happened." A week after the party, news of Augusto's arrest and the scandal hit the papers. The Times article, complete with photographs from the party, laid out the whole story: the fraud, the attempted murder, the long-lost son's return. New York society was shocked, but those who had known Augusto best seemed less surprised than resigned, as if they had always suspected something beneath his perfect facade. In his cell awaiting trial, Augusto had finally begun to speak. His confession, when it came, was comprehensive. He detailed every fraudulent transaction, every manipulated record, every step of his plan to eliminate Thomas. The weight of his crimes, once revealed, seemed to have broken something fundamental in him. "I wanted to be more than my father was," he told the FBI investigators. "I wanted to build something lasting, something powerful. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of the cost." Back at the mansion, Tommy found himself in his father's old office, now Richard's, looking at an old photograph that had been uncovered during the investigation. It showed Thomas and Augusto in their younger days, standing together, smiling, their whole futures ahead of them. "It's strange," Richard said, joining him, "looking at pictures like that, seeing who they were before everything went wrong." Tommy nodded. "People can convince themselves of anything if they want something badly enough." "Speaking of wanting things," Richard said, "what will you do now? Will you stay?" The question had been on Tommy's mind as well. The street life that had been his reality just weeks ago seemed like a distant memory now, but the future was still uncertain. Thomas appeared in the doorway, as if drawn by the conversation. "The choice is yours, son," he said quietly, "but I hope you'll give us a chance to be the family we should have been." Tommy looked between them, his father, carrying the weight of 20 years of exile and determination. Richard, who had lost the father he thought he knew but gained something like a brother, and beyond them to Doña Helena, who had kept the truth alive all these years, waiting for the right moment to let it free. "I'd like that," he said finally. "I'd like to stay." Later that evening, as the sun set over the Manhattan skyline, the remaining occupants of the mansion gathered in the garden. Martha had prepared a simple dinner, nothing like the elaborate party fare of the week before, but somehow more meaningful. They sat together, Thomas, Tommy, Richard, Doña Helena, and Martha, an unlikely family formed from the ashes of secrets and lies. The conversation was sometimes awkward, sometimes painful, but underneath it all was a current of hope, of possibility. "To new beginnings," Richard proposed, raising his glass. "To the truth," Doña Helena added. "To family," Thomas said, looking at his son. Tommy lifted his own glass, looking at these people who had become his family through the strangest of circumstances. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was unwritten. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't facing it alone. "To all of us," he said simply, And in those 3 words was everything that needed to be said. The garden lights came on automatically as darkness fell, casting a soft glow over the table. In the distance, the city continued its endless rhythm, unknowing and uncaring of the small dramas that played out within its bounds. But in this garden, on this evening, a broken family had begun to heal, and a lost boy had finally found his way home.